Please. Thank you. So it's really my pleasure to welcome and introduce Brian. So Brian is Executive Director of the Hyperledger project. So we heard about it from the earlier talks already. So Brian was a primary developer of the Apache web server. I'm sure you know, well, most of you know about it, which is the most popular web server software on the internet and a founding member of the Apache Software Foundation. He has also served on the board of the Mozilla Foundation since 2003 and the Electronic Frontier Foundation since 2013. Brian was a founding CTO of CollabNet and CTO of the World Economic Forum, and most recently, he was a managing director at Mithril Capital Management, a global technology investment firm. I'm sure there is even more of this. So please, Brian.
Thank you. And I apologize, I didn't present slides because what I wanted to kind of do is just get to understand the audience better, get to understand the other content this morning better, and maybe go in a few directions, make some observations, and then open it up for some Q&A. It sounds like lunch hopefully will be here by about noon, so that's roughly the time that we're looking at. So I wanted to tell you, before I dive in, just a little bit more about what we're doing at Hyperledger. I know you've heard it mentioned before, but we're a part of the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation has been around for about 15 years. Oddly enough, it started about 10 years after Linus himself first published his version of the Unix kernel to Usenet in 1991. And by 2001, there were companies taking out Super Bowl ads about the Linux operating system, right? And a lot of questions and concerns, both about the technology direction for the kernel. Was it always going to be Linus at the center of it, acting as this air traffic controller for all these different patches coming in? And also questions about the industry. You know, you had companies who were going public using LNUX as their public stock symbol, causing a lot of confusion in the market over who was Linux and where was it going to go. And so the Linux Foundation became it was a 501c6 and still is industry consortium. So it's a nonprofit. All of the IP created at the organization has to be published and put out into the public, and it's allowed to convene companies together and others together, but it has to follow very strict, like everybody does, antitrust rules to make sure that this isn't a cabal, something that locks things in, but instead is about creating this large public benefit. And in this case, it's about a technology platform. And the approach is to act at the center of this barbell-shaped community, where on one hand you have developers who need governance, who need a place to build their code. I mean, virtually, not physically. Physically, they sit wherever around the world, but virtually they need a home where the IP can sit, where the legal issues around the IP can be sorted out and consistent, so that when you see the Linux kernel published under an open source license, you know what that means, and everything's consistent, and all the patent issues get worked out. But also the question of who, and how do we make sure the project outlives any of its developers, any of its founders, that sort of thing. It helps solve that question. And the other side of that barbell is the commercial ecosystem, right? How do you keep vendors from stepping on each other's toes and trying to take, a sense of a proprietary claim on what is otherwise a mark that is managed by the community, right? And so partly that's about getting developers together at events, running things like training and certification processes, and trademark policies, and also helping them market, help them understand what does the Linux operating system mean in a way that is independent from any of the individual vendors. So a few years ago, this model seemed to be working, and people started to come to the Linux Foundation saying, could you repeat this for technology domains that are adjacent to the Linux operating system? So cloud computing. And the Linux Foundation launched something called Cloud Foundry, and more recently something called the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, where you see projects like Kubernetes and other interesting things kind of now finding a home, and very much after this same model of companies coming together, and by the way, funding that work, funding a core team of staff at the Linux Foundation to support this balancing act. But not paying the developers. The developers all come from either companies they work for, or they're individuals, or they're students, or they're people who simply want to be involved in advancing these platforms. The premise is if there aren't people who are going to show up and write your code under this model, then maybe it shouldn't exist, right? Rather than a different approach which would have the Linux Foundation trying to pay the salaries of everybody writing this code. That wouldn't work. So replicating this model to cloud computing, to software-defined networking, to all the these pieces of infrastructure that most of us take for granted, and we should take for granted, the same way we take plumbing and HVAC systems for granted, the same way we take, the operation of our roads and highways for granted, right? Or the operation of the internet for granted. It actually takes software developers and companies working in consensus, there's a familiar word, with an organization like the LF facilitating that kind of thing. So a year and a half ago, a bunch of different companies started to independently come to the Linux Foundation saying, there's something going on in this Bitcoin space, this blockchain space that it seems like it could use you guys involved. After determining that the Bitcoin community itself wasn't really the right kind of place for the Linux Foundation to play, because they had already built up foundations, they'd built up a governance process, imperfect as it is, sometimes you don't want to step into a community that's already underway and try to tell them what to do. That doesn't tend to work very well. But there was a recognition that underneath Bitcoin was this platform that the Bitcoin instance of which was one way of doing it, but there are different ways of doing it, right? There are different algorithms for consensus. As we've talked about here, proof of elapsed time, Byzantine fault tolerance, et cetera. There might even be different forms of smart contract language. The Ethereum community really advanced beyond Bitcoin in terms of thinking about how do you build a global unstoppable computer, right? And use a scripting language that you deploy across this network that would embody the principle of smart contracts and distributed applications. Something I resonated very strongly with, feeling like, the last 10 years of digitalization of society have been largely about centralization rather than decentralization. Why can't we get to a decentralized Uber or a decentralized Airbnb or a decentralized eBay, right? Why is it so much easier to end up creating central monopolies than what I think appealed to a lot of us when we first got on the net, which was the decentralized kind of sovereign point of view, right? Nature of the internet at the time. So a lot of these threads started to come together, and they came from sources you might expect from companies that had been involved in open source, big companies like IBM and Intel, small companies, startups in the fintech space like Digital Asset, like IntellectEU, like others who were starting to work with this new technology, as well as banks who, many of them were using Linux deep inside, but many of them had not thought of themselves as open source companies, most of which still don't. And so with all of these kind of threads coming together, Jim Zemlin at the Linux Foundation, who's the executive director there, said, let's launch a project, what should we call it? And I think it was Digital Asset that had acquired a company called Hyperledger. So 2 years ago, there was a small startup called Hyperledger with a different technology, forget about it. Here's the brand. And it was generic, it was kind of inspirational, but it meant, okay, that's probably a good brand to use. I joined in May of last year, about 6 months after it got started. And the two projects that were in Hyperledger at the time were Fabric and Sawtooth. And you've heard both of them mentioned. Fabric originally was built inside of IBM as kind of an implementation of this idea of a distributed, decentralized ledger with a smart contract engine on top using the Go programming language running inside of a virtual machine container called Docker, right? And as your smart contract engine. Not perfect, not beautiful, not necessarily designed for public networks the way the Ethereum technology stack is, but an interesting start, especially if your focus is on enabling these consortium kind of settings like we've talked about. And then Intel brought some research they've been doing internally around, as mentioned, the proof of elapsed time consensus mechanism into a project called Sawtooth. Very different architecture, written in Python rather than in Go. But these two projects sat at Hyperledger. And part of the thinking around Hyperledger at the beginning and continuously has been, rather than trying to converge us all on one single chain, the way that, say, Ethereum or Bitcoin has, with side chains for scalability or other kind of things, instead of believing, though, that this was like TCP/IP, where everybody had to be running the same protocol, instead, maybe there's a different vision of how the landscape rolls out, which is one of a lot of different chains out there, where every chain is essentially a pool of peers, and I mean that in the terms of business peers and ecosystem participants, stakeholders in a given industry or in a given set of use cases, who need to maintain a ledger and drive some automation amongst themselves. But when they want to go to other domains, what they simply need are bridges. What they need are technologies that make it possible to conduct two transactions at the same time across two different chains, right? In the pure Bitcoin concept, for example, if you wanted to buy a house using Bitcoin, well, your land title registry would be digital objects on the Bitcoin chain, and you'd have your Bitcoin itself, and you'd pay for it, and it'd be one transaction. But the reality suggests that more likely we're going to see different chains for these different purposes, and buying a house with digital assets will probably mean conducting a transaction on a Bitcoin chain or some other payments chain, and another transaction on a land titling chain. And that land titling chain might be as small as, like we do here, a single county, where the different nodes are like real estate agents and the court system and other good governance organizations, and maybe even folks who represent homeowners, right? Or it could be as large as an entire state or the US or even international. The scope of a given chain will be something that industries will kind of define. And the larger the better. We know, what was it, Metcalfe's law, the value of a network is the square of the number of nodes up to some asymptote, right? But there's also good reasons for chains to be separate. And in my take is that has to do with what I've been calling kind of a spectrum between human governance and algorithmic governance, right? Human governance is what we have today, where we get together at a city level, at a state level, or together as an industry, or together as an open source project. And we have policies, and we have bylaws, and we have rules that we follow, but the enforcement of that is human, right? The enforcement of that is we send you to jail, or we kick you out of the project, or we apply property taxes, or we simply shun you, right? And that sometimes things work. Most of the time that works. And there's obviously places where it doesn't, a lot of which have to do with imperfect application of those rules. But some of those are subjective rules anyways. At the other extreme is algorithmic governance. An example of this in Bitcoin is you cannot spend the same Bitcoin token twice. Right? The system prevents you from doing that. That's called preventing of double spend. That's built into the system. You try to propose that transaction, the system rejects it, right? That algorithmic governance is incredibly useful as a way to prevent fraud. There are other rules we could apply that might keep you from, selling a house that you don't own, for example, or trying to conduct some other act that you don't have the right permissions for. This network as a whole can reject it. Now, there are many people who would like to reinvent many of the systems of the world through pure algorithmic governance, right? By saying we can encode all sorts of businesses this way. We could encode how governments work this way. We could encode how voting works this way. But I think the reality is that for any system, there'll be somewhere in between these two extremes. The more we can automate, the more we can make the systems able to enforce these rules, the more scalable we get, but also, frankly, the more auditable and hopefully the more fair we can make these systems. So we could fight fraud. Maybe we could fight voting machine tampering. Maybe and voter registration problems, right? Maybe we can fight all sorts of injustices out there by making these systems more automatable. But we'll always still need a human governance. This was exhibited by, perhaps some of you didn't follow this, but last year there was in the Ethereum community something called the Dao Hack, which was an instance of a smart contract. I won't tell the whole story, but it was a decentralized venture capital fund that raised, at the time, what seemed like a lot of money, $150 million into this pool, but there was a bug in the code that was used to build this, and that bug allowed people to drain that fund, and the Ethereum community developers and miners got together and said, this is wrong, this is systemically wrong, and we need to fix this. And we've got 28 days, which was a characteristic of the issue, to fix this, and they did. And they reversed that transaction. Many people thought that was the wrong thing, that this was not unlike the bailout of AIG in 2008, or the bailout of long-term capital management in 96 or 7, somebody correct me, where the people who ran the commanding heights of the economy said, this other group of people took a bad risk, didn't understand what they were doing, and we have to bail them out. And that's a moral hazard kind of question. But in almost every environment, we have to have systems where the humans can at times step in and correct what is an illogical extreme, outcome from an otherwise logical and ordinary set of rules, right? So this is a question I think every one of our use cases will have to address, whether we're talking about identities for displaced people, refugees, or simply the homeless populations in the cities. What are their rights around privacy and identity matched against our ability to audit? You know, how many immunizations have you had, right? Or how many benefits have you received? There's a balancing act to strike, and in these social impact applications or other business applications, we're going to need the stakeholders to come together and talk and figure out how do we define that balance and how do we encode that in rules that the networks can enforce, but then also encode it in human governance layers that can correct those rules or recover from those rules when a bug is found, right? So part of my real appeal to folks who are thinking about social impact applications of this is the more that you can tie these things into the places where the systems of the world are being reinvented, right? Where the food supply chain or the diamond chain or the tuna fish supply chain are being reinvented through these. We should really look for opportunities to embed socially aware individuals and organizations, civil society, for lack of a better word, in the design and implementation of these chains, rather than coming in after the fact and trying to correct it and trying to make sure that the right data is being tracked and also that the right observers are on that chain, because it won't happen by itself. The good news, in my view, is that the right kind of folks are paying attention to this. I talked to regulators in DC, in the financial industries, and they are not just aware of distributed ledgers and blockchain tech, they are trying to figure out, as certain financial systems get converted to distributed ledgers, how do they become a node on that network and a co-designer of that? A much different view than regulators as people who run after the fact and chase the horse after it's left the barn. The UN and the World Food Program and the World Economic Forum all have this buzz about it, right? Which a lot of which is ill-informed, a lot of which will be, you know, yes, that use case will not need a blockchain. Yes, there's a lot of craziness, and maybe it's about Bitcoin, maybe not, who knows? But I'm really encouraged by the fact that the civil society is recognizing it has to play a role, and everybody has to get smart about that. So with that, I want to kind of open the floor then to have a conversation. What we're trying to do at Hyperledger is build the building blocks of these things and build the underlying tools. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the people operating in these spaces to figure out how to use them to reinvent the systems that they're embedded in. So with that, I think we have another 10 minutes before food shows up, hopefully.
Questions?
I think there's one back there. Correct. Yeah.
Hi. You talked about regulators being attuned to the blockchain and the new technology. In Singapore recently, just yesterday, kind of digitized and tokenized their currency. Can you talk about the impact of that as you see it?
Well, it takes more than a one-day decision for an entire nation to issue fiat currency on a chain. The Monetary Authority at Singapore, MAS, has been very pro-innovation for a while, and in the last 2 years, very pro, let's figure out how to use these distributed ledgers to make something work. So they have you know, a lab where I think Vitalik has a desk at the MAS, actually. Vitalik Buterin, who's one of the founders of Ethereum. I don't know how often he's there, but it's nice, you know, you have a city, it's nice to have a desk. And so one thing that they've been doing is creating these sandbox environments where they'll say, here's a real live data set, here's a live set of partners who want to try to wire their systems together. And so innovative companies and technologists can come in and hack and figure out how do we plug these things together. And all of Asia, frankly, has gotten meetup crazy and hackathon crazy and fintech crazy, which is really interesting. Like the appetite for working with nerds like us is really rewarding and fun. Now, some of that is driven by this sense that these cryptocurrencies are going to insane places, and I would encourage many of us to have a skeptical view of that, because that's not the value that's inherent in blockchain technology. Is going, well, Bitcoin's 2,500. Well, who says it won't go to 100K, right? That almost has nothing to do with the value of underlying distributed ledger systems. The value does come from reinventing these systems of the world. It might come from many of the existing fiat currencies becoming digital currencies, becoming as fluid as Bitcoin is, in terms of being able to move it around the world or move it between partners with zero or close to zero transaction cost. I'll note that Bitcoin has a $3 transaction cost now because its price is so high. But back to your question, MAS is a really interesting partner. Bank of England, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the state of Illinois, all three of those, they've joined Hyperledger, by the way, but they are also organizations that have internal kind of R&D groups who are realizing they need to, the fancy term is center of competency, build a center of competency internally around where this tech is heading, and recognizing there's still a lot of unsettled questions about architecture and smart contract language and stuff. They're realizing there's a core set of skills that they need to build to persevere no matter what happens on the technology landscape. So that's all pretty exciting.
Other questions?
Thank you. Can you expand upon the concept and the definition of decentralization? Because, you know, like the Bitcoin blockchain, it's 4 mints now, I think 100 miners in China, and all of them, it doesn't seem like it's decentralized, but we just throw that word around a lot.
And often I prefer the word minimum viable centralization. It's like the DNS, for example, right? The domain name system. Who considers it centralized? Right, okay, and many of us may feel like we don't really know where to stand on that question, right? DNS is fairly decentralized. There are hundreds of different registrars out there who can register a domain name for you, who've all agreed with an organization called ICANN to a set of rules around, you know, I can't issue McDonald's.com, right, to this person just because they're claiming to be McDonald's, right? That's already registered to somebody else. So the registrars have an agreement between themselves managed by ICANN, an international org, but no one would say ICANN controls the internet, or even ICANN controls DNS because much of that has been federated out, right? So by the same token, a lot of these consortium chains, I mean, you could even argue that a lot of the, as you are, that sounds like that the public cryptocurrencies, the public chains, they're decentralized to a degree, but you know, the Bitcoin developers and miners could wake up one day and decide, you know, maybe it's worth changing the algorithms to add a whole bunch of new tokens, right? To change that, as they do, to change the repayment, what is it, the repayment rate, or
the transfer fees,
the rewards for mining
transaction fees.
And the rewards for finding a block, right? It's what is it? They have the halvening, right? They have it every time because they want it to get it low. But that's a policy decision, and that's a policy decision not unlike the Federal Reserve Bank, you know, which today, if the Federal Reserve Bank changes the interest rates, they can only do that by unanimous consent of the 12 independent Federal Reserve Bank governors. Some could argue, and I think this is facetious, that the Federal Reserve Bank is more decentralized than the Bitcoin mining community, because 70% of the hash power, which is the proxy for power in the Bitcoin mining community, is in the hands of 7 or 8 mining pools, many of which gained their power by taking advantage of free electricity coming off of hydroelectric dams in the southeast of China. Like, these are bizarre things to like think about, right? Corruptively, by the way. And yet we're asked to base our systems of trust on these underlying things. It's why I go back to this notion of don't think of one global network with one solid technology where it takes, or one monolithic, I think the term was used, technology that, I mean, kind of like TCP/IP is ubiquitous, but then can take 25 years to do a major upgrade to, like we had with IPv4 to v6, right? I'm sorry, John, I don't mean to look at you when I say that. Instead, I think we're going to see a panoply of different technologies, of different chains, and that'll give us the ability to both map it to our human governance models, to the different criteria we'll have for global distribution versus high transaction rate versus close-in finality. All of these parameters, we don't even yet know what the terminology are yet, but we know that there are choices we'll be making as we deploy these. And really the standards, I think, will come from cross-chain technologies for conducting transactions, for moving assets from chain to chain, and also for identity. The ability to know if I'm going to buy a house from you, and that means conducting transactions on multiple chains, I want to know I'm dealing with the same person. Right, so that's where some of this identity work will probably be more cross-chain than many other things. I went well beyond your question. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, minimum viable centralization.
And I have the next question. I really like that terminology. I really appreciated your comment that we need to have more socially aware people developing distributed ledger and blockchain technology. I am an academic myself. What role do you think academia can play, and also centers like Citrus and the Bonato Institute, in helping to create the next generation of technologists who come with that socially aware consciousness?
It means having, it's tough, right? It means having, there's this holy trinity, or unholy trinity perhaps, between the business world, the legal world, and the programming world, right? And we already know that the world of smart contracts means that the programmers need to think more like lawyers, and the lawyers need to think more like programmers, right? Now I would add into there that having some business sense as well is important to understand what's the shape of a market and how could that evolve or should that evolve. I think the right nexus point for these are industry associations, right? In the healthcare sector, for example, there's an organization called HIMSS, H-I-M-S-S, which for health IT is largely defined kind of the terminology and the standards that communities use to interchange data. And necessarily, those conversations are partly legal, partly political, partly business, and partly technical, right? I know that in every other industry, take the most boring or the most, the biggest, there is an industry association somewhere there that's probably in the right position to go, here's where the industry is changing, and here's where we can pull the stakeholders together to make those changes. So if academia could identify those, and maybe partner between, an organization like Citrus and the Haas School of Business, right? To go in with both a social impact and a business voice, that could be pretty powerful.
Yeah, and replicate the model of blockchain and make academia decentralized itself. So we no longer have these pillars between the different departments.
That's true. Like here at Citrus or CLTC, for the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, which is another group here. I like the kind of cross-cutting nature of that. So, but find these orgs out there. And there's some of that in the governance space too, the regulators or groups like the World Economic Forum and that sort of thing.
So we have another question back here.
Yeah.
Thanks. Speaking of the Haas School of Business, I'm David Harris. I'm with the Haas School of Business.
Excellent.
I am really interested in something that you touched on a teeny bit, elections and blockchain. And if you think that blockchain is an appropriate tool for providing auditable elections or will be at some point in the future. I know there's a big identity challenge around that. I know Democracy Earth is one group that's trying to work on this, but I'm curious if you or your organizations are working on that issue or talking about it.
So there's nothing formal that Hyperledger is doing in this space, but let me give you a personal kind of view, which might help kind of explain kind of the limits of this technology as well. And let me focus this strictly on the elections process as we know it for electing leaders, president, that sort of thing. Because there are interesting side things like liquid democracy, worth taking a look. But it may be a while before those replace many of the voting systems we have today. And for me, there is a crisis in today's voting systems, one of growing lack of confidence in the fairness of how we conduct elections. And it's civilization threatening. If we don't solve this, we go down certain dark paths like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. Here's what I would not do. I would not use it as a direct replacement for voting itself. I've been a really big believer in voter-verified paper ballots as the true path to auditable elections, right? And there are certain shortcuts like vote by mail, and vote by mail works because the residents in Oregon happen to trust the Oregon government enough not to corrupt the process, and okay, we can accept that. But let's recognize that as a special case. And the main case should be you show up somewhere, or you mail it in as an assigned group, but you show up somewhere, you mark your ballot, maybe it's a computer that helps you mark that ballot, but you read that ballot, you submit it to a scanner, and it's kept in physical form where 1 out of hopefully 10, but probably more like 1 out of 100, get actually reviewed and audited. There's no role for a blockchain in that process. Where I do think there is a role for distributed ledgers is in the part that happens before, in the registration process. We do have a crisis here where a lot of people, especially in certain contested states, are showing up and being told you don't have the right to vote here, right? You're at either the wrong polling place, or I don't have you on my list, or it's hard for them to even understand where to register in the first place. There's a lot of that part of the problem that we can't solve, but one thing we could solve is having a public registry, a public distributed ledger that tracked where everyone was registered to vote. And we have to manage some privacy concerns because we don't want our home addresses necessarily part of the public record, but it should be public where me as a citizen, where I'm allowed to vote. And questions about identity, et cetera. So we could hopefully address that. But more interestingly to me is the part that comes after voting, where you go to a polling place, maybe it's somebody's garage, maybe it's a church, whatever, you put your ballots in, and you presume that at that point those ballots are counted and then reported up into the totals and on. That doesn't always happen, and we have no way independently of being able to verify other than we hope that the person running that polling place drove to the right location and didn't have an accident on the way, or their car didn't catch on fire or something like that, right? And the ballots didn't get lost, or some new box of ballots didn't show up. Imagine if instead every polling place recorded its totals to a distributed ledger, right? This many votes for this candidate, this many votes for this. Not the individual votes, certainly not like the serial number on the receipt that you got, but the totals. Then you could go, okay, this person's garage that I voted at, I saw a few other people there, they reported 500 votes over the course of a day. That feels about right and good. I see it recorded in there, and now it's summed up like an Excel spreadsheet into the total, and I can trust that that's now included in the total. But if you see that your polling place wasn't included, or that garage claimed to have recorded 12,000 votes or something like that, then that's the basis for going something funny is going on here. If we had simply that system, I think we could do a lot, both the registration and the tolling and the polling place tallying. We could do a lot to reestablish confidence in the mechanics of the elections process. So that was a 3-minute rant. Thank you for indulging me.
That's great.
So maybe one question. So apparently you designed, Hyperledger was designed with industrial concerns, a lot of in mind. Did you add also a concern about law and legal system in mind when designing the system?
Concerns about what?
About law and legal systems in mind? Or
about law and legal systems. Everything exists in the context of law and legal systems, but I think that has to do with the application of these technologies rather than, so make it programmable, right? We're building something at kind of the operating system layer, the kernel layer, right? Or the programming language layer. What we're specifically not about is a coin, right? And so, or a system of governance, right? So our presumption is that you'll stand up a network of a bunch of Fabric nodes, or a bunch of Sawtooth nodes, or a bunch of Burrow nodes, or Indy nodes, and then implement through that system whatever governance rules you feel should be algorithmic, but then a legal contract between parties that reflects whatever the human governance relationship is, right? And so, like, when we think about the application of this in healthcare, right, there's nothing that really needs to drive into the code something that makes it aware that it's being used in a healthcare context. There might be big privacy issues you have to be able to handle, big other requirements that are systemic. But we kind of leave law as an exercise to the reader, and that seems to work. I don't know if there's something more we could or should be doing. But certainly, I think the GDPR rules are something that's been on my mind as one reason we launched the Indy project, which is a path to being able to implement. These are the privacy rules coming into effect in the European Union starting in May of next year, which means that any one of you who, if you're a European citizen, you'll have the right to demand any company, European Union or not, to be able to let you know what data they have about you, let you be able to inspect it, let you be able to correct it, and let you be able to delete it if it's no longer needed by the business. And no longer needed is a question, but all of these are great from the perspective of the end user and horrible from the perspective of the company. If you don't have a system like what's being built with Indy, it becomes a lot more complicated. And hopefully what it means for you all is you'll have a wallet that'll be like not just your Bitcoin wallet or your cryptocurrency wallet, but your healthcare data wallet, your home title and car title wallet, your other digital assets wallet that you'll be able to take between different folks and different vendors, not be something like a portal that you're viewing your data on somebody else's site.
We have a question about.
I had a question.
I'll keep talking till lunch is here, so.
Yeah.
I have 5 minutes.
The sandwiches arrived. Maybe this is moot, but
I won't keep you from lunch, I promise.
just you've kind of mentioned a little bit about the hard fork in Ethereum, and I just kind of want to hear your thoughts on error correction. You know, how we go about dealing with errors that get put onto these systems.
Okay, so all software has bugs, right? The last, I subscribe very strongly to the belief the last defect is fixed when the last user is dead. And I had to stop telling that joke when I got involved in health IT for a little while. It had very different implications there. Yeah, we have to have a mechanism for correction. And it's good that it's hard to make really important corrections, like the big debate happening in the Bitcoin community between SegWit and 2MB. I mean, like all the different approaches to evolving that. It's good that that's not a frivolous decision, right? Because these decisions do have ramifications, and they do benefit some parties over others, right? But we need the ability to have those conversations and make those changes. And whether those are non-disruptive changes that are soft forks, that everybody can come along, and those who disagree, well, at least they, don't veto the decision, whatever, then that's great. If they're hard forks, and I mean, this is like in any human consensus driving process. If everybody in this room was trying to decide, we're going to order 100 pizzas, and we can only get them of one type, right? Do we all agree that it's pepperoni, or do we go, vegan and meat lover, right? That's a fork. That's a split. And sometimes communities need to fork that way because sometimes they grow apart, right? Just like humans. I won't go there. That's an essential community management attribute, and recognizing that as a failure or whatever is appropriate in some circumstances. When people who owned assets in owned Ethereum tokens, woke up one morning and discovered instead of 100 Ethereum tokens, they owned 79 Ethereum tokens and 21 ETCs, Ethereum Classics, that was kind of a surprise, right? But that's built into the model. And it's why cryptocurrencies in the vein of Bitcoin and Ethereum won't be the last ones, aren't the only word when it comes to designing these systems.
Maybe one last question.
Hi, you just said something very interesting before about being the technology. One of the things that, how are we going to police making sure people update the software? Because if you're delivering software, and yes, you can have the fork in terms of Ethereum, but if they don't do the bug fixing, what are we going to do about that? Because it's only one software in reality at this point.
So that's obviously a broad question beyond blockchains and distributed ledgers. So trying to limit my response to that. In a permissionless world, right, you do have to either make changes that everyone can agree to and bring everyone along, or you have to split, right? And there are some interesting approaches. There's a blockchain tech called Tezos, where the rule sets are more encoded as smart contracts and more people can vote, and it should be easier to roll out changes, less disruptive, perhaps even invisible to most people unless they strongly object. So interesting work going on there. In a permissioned setting or a consortium setting, the changing of the algorithmic rules is probably correlated to changing of the human governance rules, right? And there's some process by which that group needs to agree on those changes or agree to disagree, in which case they need to break up, right? And it's just as hard when you're talking about getting technologists to agree to something as it is to get Congress to agree to something, right? We shouldn't expect it to be any easier, at least. So no easy answers other than say it's a human problem, not just a technology problem.
It's a great place to stop for lunch. Join me in thanking Brian.
Thank you. Thank you.